of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ronald Reagan was America's oldest ever president, and its most popular. His 8 years in office saw the end of the Cold War and the start of the biggest economic boom in American history.
With God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us.
Reagan, already beyond retirement age, had a reputation for occasional public fluffs and gaffes.
He toasted Princess Diana as Princess David at a White House dinner. It was an extraordinarily dim mistake to make, but it was quite common by the end, you know.
These lapses could be simple absent-mindedness or signs of a deeper malaise. When Ronald Reagan was running against President Carter in 1980, America had experienced a decade of turmoil. The 1970s saw defeat in Vietnam and the disgrace of Watergate. The Cold War seemed as intractable as ever, and American economic supremacy had been overtaken by Japan.
Can anyone look at our reduced standing in the world today and say, let's have 4 more years of this?
Reagan was sold to the American public as a leader who would restore national pride. But there was another side to his 8 years in the White House. Now, altered statesmen will diagnose Reagan's presidency from a new perspective and reveal the medical conditions that plagued him during his time in office. The future 40th President of the United States was born in Tampico, Illinois, on the 6th of February, 1911. At his inauguration, on January the 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was just 2 weeks short of his 70th birthday.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will...
What you saw was what you got with President Reagan. After all, he succeeded to the presidency at the age of 69, which is I guess older than almost any other person who ever became president.
As President of the United States, Ronald Reagan was responsible for the fate of millions. At an age when many people would be reassessed for a driving license, Reagan was in control of the world's most powerful war machine.
When President Reagan came into office, physically he was in excellent condition. From the standpoint of his mental condition, I think it's fair to say that he reflected his age. And the problem is with aging is individuals are unable to shift reflectively in their thinking. They are unable to assess different events and and access different pieces of information and put them together in the whole.
These difficulties happen because by age 70, a person's body and mind are declining rapidly. Their reflexes can be slowed by up to a quarter, and the ability to reason and remember is also decreased. Some people are lucky exceptions to this decline. But as he entered the White House, there's no evidence to suggest Ronald Reagan was out of the ordinary in this respect.
The most common thing we see in individuals 70 years or older, the inability to recall recent events, recent details. Recent memory tends to be a little bit of failure. Now, if you're surrounded by confidence and people to prop you up, they can let you know who this is that you're being introduced to, what facts, and that can be very helpful for a president. But I think he reflected some of those difficulties with names and places, the kind of things that most people at age 70 would have a little difficulty with.
Reagan may have been in good physical shape for his 70 years, but he was vulnerable to one of the key effects of aging. Older people find it harder to bounce back from serious injury. The 30th of March, 1981, 7 weeks after Reagan's 70th birthday. At 2:30 p.m., the president was leaving the Washington Hilton after delivering an address to the Construction Trades Council. As he stepped from the building, an unknown gunman opened fire. Chaos ensued. This moment would be crucial to the future of the president in ways no one at the time would suspect. The man who bundled him into a waiting car was Secret Service agent Jerry Parr.
Once I was in the car, and I noticed this window that had a bullet hole in it and the 3 bodies on the sidewalk, I pushed the president up into a sitting position right here and kneeled in front of him and started to examine him.
A would-be assailant has taken shots at President Reagan. President Reagan, according to the White House, is unscathed. The president, I repeat for emphasis, was not hit.
But Reagan's situation was serious.
He had taken a handkerchief out of his pocket, spit up on it, and said, "I think I cut the inside of my mouth." But when I saw this bright red and frothy blood, I knew it was a lung injury. So that's when I made that decision to go. And I said to the driver, "George Washington Hospital."
When they reached the hospital a few minutes later, Reagan just managed to walk through the outer doors before collapsing in the corridor.
What I didn't know and what no one knew was that this bullet had ricocheted off that right rear quarter panel, hit him in the armpit, hit a rib, and then cascaded and tumbled over and over and over, maybe 8 or 10 inches, diagonally across his left lung. He was bleeding to death inside of his lung.
There's a fragment. It's near the heart.
When he came in the emergency room, oh, it was life or death. That's how serious. Once you start hemorrhaging rapidly, your blood pressure goes down, your lung collapses, you go into shock, you die. 10 minutes more. I think if he'd have gone to the White House, he'd have been dead.
To save his life, Reagan needed immediate surgery to staunch massive internal bleeding and remove the bullet lodged less than an inch from his heart. During the 3 hours when he was on the operating table, chaos reigned amongst his aides and staff.
I can't answer those questions because I wasn't there. But there were apparently 3 persons shot, and all I know on that is what I heard, what I got off the wire.
While Reagan was in surgery, there was a press conference at the White House. Here, Secretary of State Al Haig tried to answer reporters' questions about who was in charge.
Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State in that order. And should the President decide he wants to transfer the helm to the Vice President, he will do so.
Who makes that decision?
As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending return of the Vice President, and in close touch with him. If something came up, I would check with him.
Haig was trying to give an impression of calm and stability, but he was wrong about the order of succession, and Reagan, who was unconscious, was in no position to transfer power to anybody. The 25th Amendment of the American Constitution allows for the transfer of power when the president is incapacitated. Its Section 4 states, whenever the Vice President and a majority of the Executive Department transmit their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting President. At George Washington Hospital, 70-year-old President Reagan was undergoing emergency surgery after a near-fatal shooting. But the mechanisms of the 25th Amendment, which would devolve power to Vice President Bush, were never put into practice.
We basically made the decision not to invoke the 25th Amendment based on what the doctors told us. They told us that the president was going to have surgery, but that he would only be under the anesthetic for a brief period of time. A couple of hours, I think, 2 or 3 hours. Vice President was flying back. He was in the air for 2 or 3 hours. And so we concluded that it would not be the best thing to do under the circumstances to get the cabinet together to devolve power upon the Vice President the way it normally is done.
Indeed, the 25th Amendment and the papers of invocation for the Sections 3 and Section 4 of the 25th Amendment dealing with presidential disability, these were actually stowed away in a safe at the request of Baker so as to preclude any discussion of potential inability in the president during this period of time.
The Cold War was almost hot in those days. We felt it was important that there not be seen to be a hiatus in the operation of the U.S. government.
But in fact, White House physician Daniel Ruge reckons there was a period of 10 to 15 hours when Reagan was unable to function as president and could not have responded to a crisis. And all that time, Reagan's nuclear briefcase containing the response codes to authorize retaliation against a possible Soviet attack was sitting by his bedside. The morning after the shooting, Reagan's aides also gathered by his bedside. They had to decide what to tell the country about the president's condition.
The administration wanted very much to communicate that Reagan was in charge, that Reagan was not incapacitated, and as a matter of fact, the American people never knew that he was within 5 minutes of dying. He was in critical condition, but they didn't want anyone to know this. They wanted to communicate that he was still in control.
To show Reagan was in charge, his aides asked him to sign a piece of legislation about dairy farming the morning after the operation. This was despite the fact that he'd had his chest cracked open, had a bullet removed, lost more than 50% of his blood, been under general anesthetic, was on heavy doses of narcotic painkillers, had drainage tubes in his chest, and needed supplemental oxygen.
The 25th Amendment speaks in terms of incapacity and inability to perform. It doesn't say take a vacation. It doesn't say that the cabinet can devolve power to the vice president if they think the president needs a vacation. I mean, that's not the way it works. You're supposed to look at it in terms of incapacity and inability to perform the functions of the office. We had the president sign that legislation the day after the shooting to show that he was indeed capable of continuing to perform the duties of his office.
For a president who has just undergone a general anesthetic, it would be entirely inappropriate for him to be considering any legislative matters, much less signing any legislative documents one day after surgery. And I would submit that he was not even aware that he was signing this document. I would wager that if he were asked 3 months later about the document, that he would have been totally unaware of it.
The 25th Amendment surely should have been invoked. This is exactly what it was designed for. As a consequence of not invoking the 25th Amendment, you had a group of non-elected officials performing in this role instead.
But those officials knew Reagan trusted them, and in his hour of need, they were at his side.
Sort of a troika developed. You know, a three-headed monster, in a way, developed. Ed Meese, who was a hard-right conservative, Jim Baker, who was a moderate, and Michael Deaver, who was a moderate. And the three of them would pretty much decide what would reach the president, what would not reach the president, what legislation he should look at, whether he should sign 1 piece or 10 pieces or whatever it might happen to be. And basically, they are the ones that steered the executive branch during this period of time.
During Reagan's 12 days in hospital, his staff also tried to control the flow of information to reporters.
The press releases suggested that Reagan, even though he was hospitalized, was very much aware of what was happening, was meeting with his aides, was talking with his aides, and he was to a degree, but certainly not actively involved.
I saw him within a couple of days, and I was frankly horrified. He just looked, I'd never seen anybody look so completely drained. He just looked like a burst balloon, and he never was fat or anything, but everything had drained out of him, and he looked, I thought it'd be months or years before he ever recovered.
While his aides saw how damaged Reagan was, the public never did.
The nation was astounded with how energetic he seemed as he would wave from the hospital window, but in fact, his appearances were very carefully monitored to coincide with those times when he was lucid and in full command, which were only about an hour a day. Much of the rest of the time, he was disoriented, extremely fatigued, and it's an interesting example of covering up the magnitude of the health problems of the leader.
12 days after the shooting, Reagan left hospital.
What are you going to do when you get home? Sit down.
On April the 28th, the president made a triumphant appearance before Congress. He was welcomed as a hero for his narrow escape and had ready a carefully crafted speech.
Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas.
With the wave of sympathy felt by both Republicans and Democrats, he managed to pass his budget through the House without opposition. But the shooting had aged him. He didn't look the same man who'd campaigned for the White House just a few short months before. And there were long-term implications that no one could see at the time.
You know, even his own son, Ron Reagan Jr., in an interview with me, said, well, of course something happened to my father after he was shot. I don't know if he was just tired. He was an older man. I don't know. But of course he was different. And everybody says that. He was different after he was shot.
He very nearly died. It's a matter of record that he lost half of his blood supply so rapidly that the operating team were afraid they were going to lose him. Privately, his friends admitted, although they would die rather than admit it now, that he was not the same man after that assassination attempt that he had been before.
Some argue this change was caused by the shooting, and doctors have noted that older patients who suffer a major trauma with massive blood loss can sustain permanent brain damage.
Elderly individuals who undergo such trauma or undergo such anesthetics, we begin to see some changes that may accelerate the process of aging, and I would suggest the historical record is very, very stark with respect to that document.
After the shooting, it's possible the effects of aging were accelerating inside Reagan's brain. But what the outside world saw was a brave elder statesman battling to recover his strength. In the months after leaving hospital, Reagan eased himself gently back to work.
He did go to some meetings in his pajamas and a bathrobe, and so his aides would meet with him, and he would not be dressed. He would just be still recuperating.
The First Lady made it very clear she wanted to make sure that he was not overtaxed, that we were not going to put too much stuff on him. But we'd pretty much established a routine in that regard that met those considerations anyway.
But however gently he's taking it, for a president, routine means press conferences. And in the aftermath of the shooting, some observers began to notice Reagan having difficulty with his memory.
Press conferences could be a terrific embarrassment. You'd sit there squirming. As soon as he was off the cue cards, he was in terrific trouble. They used to prep him. They spent hours rehearsing him in what to say if this question was asked, if that question was asked. Quite often he'd give the wrong answer to the right question or vice versa, or he'd give the right answer, but then a supplementary would completely floor him.
Over the projected
unless he was speaking with a teleprompter and had a very structured circumstance in which he was dealing, time and again we see failures of communication from the great communicator who was no longer mastering his briefs.
Amongst the press, there were stories about Reagan's aides making important decisions without consulting him. In August 1981, when Navy jets shot down 2 Libyan planes, news of the dogfight was broadcast on national television. But White House correspondent Leslie Stahl later recorded that Reagan was left sleeping while his staff dealt with the crisis, and that the president only learned what had happened when he awoke from his night's sleep.
He had naps, and lots of people have cat naps in the afternoon, and they call them power naps, at least if they're world leaders, they call them power naps. At Reagan, they were much longer. He would say on his schedule, 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock staff time, but everybody knew that staff time meant the president going to bed. These were not 5 minutes here and there. This was a good, long sleep.
Fact of the matter is during this period of time, he was subpar, both physically and mentally.
During his first summer in office, 70-year-old Ronald Reagan was recovering from a near-fatal shooting. That year, the press talked about a detachment from office and problems with memory. But Reagan's image with the man on the street was very different, with polls calling him a consistent and resilient leader. To fully understand how Reagan could present 2 such contradictory pictures, we have to travel back in time to the heart of the American Midwest during the 1920s. Here, young Ronald and his older brother Neil were brought up by their parents, theater-loving Nell and her husband Jack. But in the furtive days of Prohibition, the Reagans had to hide a dark secret. Jack was a chronic alcoholic. Moving from job to job and occasionally arrested for drunkenness, he led the Reagans from small town to small town across the length and breadth of Illinois.
Reagan tells the story of coming home one snowy night. He was about maybe 9 years old, and he found his father unconscious in the snow. And he pulled him through the snow, pulled him up onto the porch, pulled him into the living room, and then left him in the living room and went upstairs. And interestingly, he says in his autobiography, now I was part of it. Now I was part of the cover-up of my father's problem. The children of alcoholics tend to have certain characteristics as a result of their interaction with their alcoholic parent. They lie to cover for their alcoholic parent. Oh, my father is sick, he can't come to parent-teachers meetings. Or my father can't go to work today because he has the flu, or whatever it might happen to be. That they develop sort of an unreal world. They live in an unreal world.
Turning the world of dreams into a profession, Ronald Reagan became an actor in Hollywood. And some people say that on occasions, he might have blurred the distinction between real and unreal.
He'd always had this extraordinary ability to reinvent his own past. All the stories about how he believed he'd been at the concentration camps when they were first liberated. In fact, he'd seen a film of them being liberated. He believed he'd served in the army. He'd made films about serving in the army. The way he completely blanked out his first marriage to Jane Wyman because it had ended unhappily. And as far as he was concerned, it virtually didn't exist.
Moving on from Hollywood, Reagan became governor of California in 1966. But he inherited some traits from his movie star days, notably the desire to be guided through a role.
Reagan had never wanted to be a director. Some actors do want to become a director. Reagan had never wanted to be a director because he really wasn't interested in directing other people. He wanted to accept direction for himself.
During his political life, this meant that Reagan, in the words of his chief of staff Donald Reagan, chose his aides and then followed their advice without question. But if his aides got it wrong, the consequences for the president and America could be disastrous.
He knew what he believed in, and he knew what he thought. He set the course in the big picture, and then he relied on his associates and subordinates and colleagues to fill in the canvas.
I've just always believed that you delegate. You choose the best people you can. You give them authority to do a task, and you don't intervene unless the task isn't getting done.
In matters that he didn't much care about. In other words, the minutiae of general policy which bored him, small matters. He was quite happy to take direction, and he would just simply sign the box on the document. This little box, the check in the box is the essence of presidential power, yes or no. Ronald Reagan.
This system meant that Reagan could be very hands-off, without the day-to-day business of government grinding to a halt. The disengaged president, noted by White House journalists in the summer of 1981.
There were lots of stories when I was in Washington about people who'd been invited to the White House for lunch and expected the president to go off and attend to matters of state afterwards. Instead, they'd be given a lengthy tour of the White House, laced with lots and lots of reminiscences about the time Reagan had spent in Hollywood.
But outside the White House, the American public saw a very different picture of Reagan. The success of this image was also based on his Hollywood past.
Well, the president was an actor. That was his vocation before he became a politician, and the political stage is perfectly set for an actor who can have a teleprompter to get him through.
Reagan's staff knew his strengths and weaknesses, and they knew how to use his screen abilities to best effect.
Ronald Reagan was constantly being put in situations where he would look good. Any president is. Every president is.
You're a great man.
Well, we knew he was good on television, really good. So every chance we had, we would get him take the opportunity to get him on television to talk directly to the American people. If possible, over the heads of the filters, the network anchors and people who wanted to come in and tell the American people what they'd just seen. And we were successful in doing that.
We'll put up a new one.
The poet called Miss Liberty's torch the lamp beside the golden door.
Reagan's acting skills proved their worth in the biggest role of his life, the president.
Thank you. God bless you, and God bless America.
And he was convincing. In 1984, he was nominated by the Republicans to run for a second term. Then, on October the 7th, 1984, during a debate with Democratic presidential candidate Walter Mondale, the American public got a glimpse of Reagan they'd not seen before.
You said, "There you go again." Right? Remember the last time you said that? Mm-hmm. You said it when President
On national
Carter
TV, the president was seen to be confused and lost for
"There
words.
you go again, Mr. President." And
The
what did you
American
do right
public
after
was
that?
horrified by Reagan's appearance and command of the issues in that first debate. And I can remember his positions with my colleagues around the coffee table in the doctor's lounge watching the debate. And we're turning to one another and saying, what's going on here? This guy is so out of sorts. So what we were seeing was a vintage Reagan of years to come, unfortunately, during that first debate.
Reagan's performance was so extraordinary that psychologists like Brian Butterworth were asked to analyze his speech to see if there was any medical significance to his incoherence.
What I was asked to do was examine the speech of President Ronald Reagan to see whether the speech showed any signs of disturbance that could indicate something amiss with his brain functioning. So we did something really very, very simple. We looked at the number of mistakes that the speaker made, measured as a rate. The number of mistakes per 1,000 words is what we did. And what we wanted to see was whether Reagan's speech on these particular measurements was more like patients, particularly patients with degenerative conditions, or whether it was more like normal people. And what we found was that there was a dramatic increase in the number of errors that President Reagan made in 1984 as compared to 1980. In 1980, he was practically word perfect, whereas in 1984, the error rates, particularly for grammatical errors, was in the patient range.
With regard to the progressivity, as I've said,
we looked to see whether any of this could be the effect of speaking fast, and it turns out he was actually speaking slower in his debates with Mondale than he was in his debates with Carter. So the effect of errors seemed to us to be a very secure difference between 1980 and 1984. This is the kind of decline that you might expect in somebody who's contracted a degenerative brain disease. And so we thought there was a very real possibility that in the period from 1980 to 1984, this is what had happened to President Reagan.
2 weeks later, at the second debate, things didn't look good.
Our analysis shows that he made just as many errors and more confusions than he made in the first. In fact, if I may just quote here, he said, "Do you want to see America return to the policies of weakness of the last 4 years, or do we want to go forward marching together as a nation of strength?" Well-formed sentence, but the last 4 years were the 4 years of Reagan's own administration. So was he well located in time and space would be the clinician's question here.
Reagan seemed to be on the ropes, but he had one last trick to play.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
It was very funny, and it just saved the day, because people wanted to vote for him. They wanted to get past the age thing, so he made his little joke, and everybody said, "Oh, good, now I can vote for him."
In 1984, Reagan won the election with the biggest landslide in American history.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute...
America's oldest president was taking office for a second term. But like his first term, it wasn't long before he was in hospital, and this time he was 74. On the 13th of July, 1985, during a routine intestinal checkup, it was discovered that Reagan had developed a tumor in his colon.
They found that it was cancer and that the cancer had spread. It was not contained to the growth, it had spread. And so not only the growth, but 2 feet of his intestines had to be removed. And Reagan took a long time to recuperate from it.
Reagan was unconscious for several hours while the surgeons operated. But the 25th Amendment, which allows the constitutional transfer of power to the vice president when the president cannot perform his duties, was again not invoked. A few hours after the operation, Reagan was asked to read and sign a letter. This simple exercise was the only test made to see if he was in full command of his faculties after major surgery under a general anesthetic.
There were no questions addressed really with regard to the letter. To read is not necessarily to understand, but this satisfied the 2 officials who were doing the judgment, and neither of which wasn't the vice president, wasn't a member of the cabinet. These were staffers that were making that judgment.
So once again, Reagan's administration made a decision not to invoke the 25th Amendment and devolve power from the president after major surgery.
I believe it's really outrageous to expect someone who's just gone through major surgery to be exercising power immediately.
Yet only 5 days later, Reagan was being asked to approve a major covert operation to secure the release of 7 American hostages held by Islamic militants in Beirut.
It was during that time when Reagan was recovering, when Reagan was in pain, he was on morphine, he was on various drugs, McFarlane asked Reagan to approve the arms for hostages deal, under which we would give arms to Iran and Iran would release American hostages.
This was illegal. A federal law banned arms sales to any nation connected to terrorism, and high on that list was Iran. Even more controversial was the siphoning off of profits from those arms sales to fund the Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua. And the degree of Reagan's involvement in the Iran initiative is still a contested issue.
The president had read the paper, was fully on top of it, wanted to talk about it. And for about a half hour, he and I and Don Regan parsed the risks, potential gains, and he gave me the guidance to go ahead. The point is, he was very much on top of things, not at all groggy, fully conscious of what he was saying. I never saw any inability to focus.
Chief of Staff Ronald Reagan, who admits that the president trusted his lieutenants to act on his intentions rather than on his spoken instructions, has a very different version of events.
McFarlane had told him a little bit, but he did not go through the whole plan at that point. I don't think the president really took in the significance of it. He himself was probably not feeling that great at that time. And, you know, the sort of thing that goes in, sort of registers in your brain, and then promptly you forget that when other things happen, and he went on to other things, and he did not recall exactly what had happened.
When the Iran-Contra scandal broke 16 months later, in November '86, the big question was, what did the president know? Was he aware that his staff were breaking the law? Or did they have so much autonomy they could illegally sell thousands of sophisticated missiles without Reagan being aware of it?
All these officials want everybody to believe that he was not failing and that he was 100% there. And yet when it comes to Iran-Contra, he was failing and he wasn't 100% there. Which is it?
Reagan himself didn't really clarify things. On November the 13th, he went on TV denying any arms sales to Iran.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
Then, 6 days later, he went on record admitting arms had been sold to Iran, but denying that other countries had been involved.
We, as I say, have had nothing to do with other countries or their shipment of arms or doing what they're doing.
But half an hour later, his office was issuing a correction, explaining that other countries had been involved. To clear things up, Reagan established the Tower Commission to investigate what was becoming known as Iran Gate. But he still seemed confused about his own role in the affair.
When the Tower Commission asked him if he had approved the transfer of arms for hostages, Reagan sent 3 different messages to them, 3 different answers. The first answer was, yes, I did approve it, and I know when I approved it. It was December of 1985. Then he sent a letter, another letter, saying, yes, I did, but I can't remember when I approved it. And then he sent a third letter saying, I can't remember if I approved it or if I didn't approve it.
This was becoming the biggest American scandal since Watergate. In February 1987, Senator John Tower, head of the commission, delivered a damning conclusion about events at the White House.
There was a deliberate effort to mislead by those who prepared these materials. I don't believe that the president wittingly misled the American people.
Although cleared of willful deception, the report did think Reagan was forgetful and unaware. It also described a situation in the White House of ineptitude, verging on incompetence from the president on down.
I want to thank the members of the board again. And now, John, I'm sure there will be a few questions for you.
Reagan refused to take questions from the press.
Mr. President, with the Iranians.
Are you leaving?
Have you thought about
Will
it?
Donald Reagan, the board will Donald Reagan, sir, will Donald Reagan be leaving as your chief of staff?
But a few days later, with the aid of a teleprompter, an address to the American people nudged his approval level up to 50%.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Reagan admitted mistakes, but he still seemed unclear about his own role in Iran-Contra, despite several months of investigation and the findings of the Tower Commission.
Well, the conclusion was nobody was manning the ship of state. No one was at the helm. No one was home, to use one of the phrases, during that period of time.
The Tower Commission report outlined how Reagan's system of delegating responsibility could go horribly wrong. In its aftermath, Senator Howard Baker replaced Don Regan as Chief of Staff. Howard Baker asked one of his aides, James Cannon, to conduct an investigation into the workings of the presidency.
Cannon was astounded to find that something like 3/4 of the mid-level and senior White House staff raised questions about the capacity of Reagan to be president. He seemed to have his mind adrift, to not be focusing, to not read briefing papers, to not be really interested in carrying out the duties of the president.
And James Cannon came back to Howard Baker and said, I suggest the possible invocation of Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. Things were that bad.
Baker got together with a group of aides on the 2nd of March 1987 to observe Reagan closely. But at no time did they subject the president to any specific medical tests.
Baker merely took it upon himself to make the judgment that after speaking with the president, upon hearing Cannon's concerns, he seemed to think the president was functioning pretty well, and the issue was laid to rest and was never resurrected beyond that point.
It seems clear that political considerations outweighed medical considerations. The White House physician was not called in. The way of really detecting significant impairment of intellectual functions is with psychological testing and sophisticated neuropsychological interviewing. This was not done. And it's also well known that people who have suffered impairment can maintain style. They can look the same in the way they convey themselves, even though the content, the capacity within is failing. And Reagan, after all, was a master of style.
For most of his presidency, Ronald Reagan kept his poise in the public eye. But it does seem he had increasing problems with memory. Whether this was the effect of repeated surgery and medication, or whether it was something deeper, no one has yet fathomed. In 1994, 5 years after leaving the White House, he announced in a letter to the American people that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. But some observers think this could have started while he was president.
I simply think that you've got to look at the natural history of the disease. Within 3 years of leaving office, it was an accepted fact that he had Alzheimer's. That did not arise in a closet de novo. That happened, that was an ongoing progressive condition.
Alzheimer's disease starts in the area of the brain associated with memory. It then spreads to affect the brain as a whole, killing millions of cells in its wake. Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia in old people. It's responsible for more than 50% of dementia and affects 20% of people over 75 years old.
Alzheimer's disease characteristically is a very insidious process. It generally comes on over several years. One of the reasons why it would be hard to notice in the work environment is that a lot of the aids that someone with Alzheimer's disease might use are the same kinds of aids that people would use under normal circumstances.
He had cue cards on which everything was written down, and each one contained one sentence or one idea, and he would work his way through them and deliver them brilliantly. And if you were just listening, you'd think that it was all spontaneous thought. It had just come off the top of his head. In fact, it was all carefully written down, and when he lost the cue cards, he was pretty well finished.
In that situation, the person with Alzheimer's disease is much more likely to be exposed as having a genuine deficit with their memory.
And Reagan did require help with questions when he was away from a script.
Doing everything we can.
Helping a partner in difficulties is a classic sign of life with Alzheimer's.
There's a sort of a very subtle, almost imperceptible transfer of responsibility in a household from the person with Alzheimer's disease to those around them.
Without support, Alzheimer's sufferers can easily end up in situations where their memory loss is painfully obvious. Reagan certainly seemed vulnerable in 1990, the year after he left the White House. Then he gave evidence at the trial of John Poindexter over the Iran-Contra scandal.
I can't recall, and I can't set down the dates of the meeting, but I can't recall.
This, or a variation on it, was Reagan's answer to 124 questions. He didn't recognize the name of his chairman of military chiefs, whom he'd met every day for 3 years. The only member of his cabinet he could remember was George Bush. The brain scans that can diagnose Alzheimer's were never done on Ronald Reagan while he was in the White House, so we'll never know whether he had the disease while he was president.
Very clearly, the impact of the aging brain came to manifest itself during his second term. From the time of the first presidential debate on, I think you can see event after event that suggests to me that he was reflecting the early stages of the disease.
I think that looking back now, when we know that Reagan does indeed have Alzheimer's disease, it does seem fairly certain that when we did our analyses, that he was in the early stages of that particular condition. My own view is that it probably started fairly soon after the assassination attempt, say in 1981 or 1982.
I think an observer, even where I was sitting, saw it, and I think people close in knew it. And so far, very few have been willing to come out and say anything about it at all.
The courtiers to the king take their very reputation from the performance of the king and the reputation of the king. So it is not surprising, not only that they will cover up that illness, but also that afterwards they will deny that there was ever any impairment of the presidential functioning at all.
While outside observers reckon they could detect early signs of Alzheimer's, Reagan's aides who worked closely alongside him didn't see any problems.
People have asked me before, did I detect anything in President Reagan's demeanor that would foreshadow Alzheimer's? And the answer I've given consistently is no. But then I was not working with him on a daily basis in the last 4 years because I'd left the White House and become Treasury Secretary.
Surely through 1985, when I left the administration, there was never any indication of any difficulty in memory or ability to focus. Indeed, to the contrary.
Ronald Reagan's hands-off approach and the trust he placed in his staff could have allowed the administration to function if he was ailing, but there would be a cost.
One of the consequences of having a president who is ill and sustaining that healthy image is that the decisions being attributed to the president are often being made by his small inner circle of aides, and the public is being duped.
Still, Reagan was America's most popular president, and he led the country through the biggest boom time in its history. Tragically, in his final years, Reagan's condition worsened. As Alzheimer's disease took its terrible toll, he became unable to recognize even the faces of his own family. But while Reagan himself can never recall the past, there are millions of Americans who still think of him with affection.